Rashid Telbusoğlu with Rumi Forum. I'm the program director here. We have Jim Harrington, all the way from Texas. Let me quickly introduce him as well. Jim is a human rights attorney with nearly 4 decades of experience, and he's founder and director of the Texas Civil Rights Project. He graduated from School of Law at the University of Detroit, from where he holds a master's in philosophy. He has taught at the University of Texas School of Law as an adjunct professor for 26 years, and he has handled landmark civil rights cases, written and published widely, and served on human rights delegations in different areas of the world. And he is also author of the book, Wrestling with Free Speech, Religious Freedom and Democracy in Turkey, The Political Trials and Times of Fethullah Gülen. And this will be the main focus of the talk today. It's going to be about the book. And after the event, we'll have the books available for purchase, $15 currently. And we have some food available in the back, so feel free to help yourself with that as well. The program will take about an hour. We'll have an opportunity for Q&A, and I strictly encourage you to ask some questions. So I'll leave the floor to Jim.
Thanks, and thank you all for inviting me over to Washington. It's nice to actually get away from the hot weather, and but I don't know about the rain. But anyway, it's thank you. It's I guess it's kind of a fluke in a sense. I ended up writing the book. I happened to be in church one morning, and somebody shouted out from the back, a judge who's a friend of mine, said, "Anybody want to go on a trip to Turkey? There's an interfaith trip happening." And so it was in November. It was in October, and I had enough time, so I went. And that was the first that I actually became aware of anything about the movement. I didn't know very much about Islam, Turkey, and nothing about the movement. And so we were on a trip, ecumenical trip, for about 10 days. And then when I came back, somebody asked me to write the book about the trial that Fethullah Gülen was involved in. And I resisted. First of all, I didn't know anything. There had been a trial. It was all news to me. And you know, I was teaching and running the Civil Rights Project, so I had plenty of work to do. And so I said, nah, and they said, well, think about it. So about a month later, folks came back and, you know, talked me into it. I did learn something from that experience, and it is never go to lunch with a Turk, because you're going to twist your arm until you do something. So anyway, I ended up writing the book, and I was interested, you know, because the kind of work that I do, was always interested in writing something or doing something about international human rights law. You don't usually get that chance in Texas. So, and I think particularly since it was a case in which Fethullah Gülen won. You know, typically in political trials that happen, the person usually loses and usually ends up in jail or even executed. So this was an interesting political trial that had a twist to it, in that the person who was on trial won. So I decided, so I wrote about that, and I kind of learned a lot about history, learned a lot about the Turkish legal system, and also what was the nature of the politics, what was going on here that made it a political trial. You know, as I mentioned, you know, typically when you have a political trial, the outcome is not very good. I mean, we have, in history, we have, you know, trial of Socrates, of course, the trial of Jesus, we have the Inquisitions that went on, the Salem women here in the United States, and then John Scopes, you know, that from Tennessee. So in this case, even though it was a painful prosecution and lasted altogether 8 years, the result was good for Fethullah Gülen, of course, since he won, but it was also really important for Turkey. It was an important epoch in advancing democracy a step forward. So I'm just going to, what I thought I would do is kind of go through an outline and I have sort of 4 or 5 points to talk about. One is why prosecute Fethullah Gülen and the Hizmet organization that's related to him. And this was a man that Monsignor Marovich, who was the representative of the Vatican at that time, called a saint. When I went and interviewed him, he called Fethullah Gülen a saint. B, what was the charge? C, who was the opposition? 4, D, who were the actors? And the last point is, what was the wild card that changed the whole gist of this? And the other thing I want to mention, I think, sort of in the introduction, is I don't. This disclaimer might not be as important here, but I've been traveling to Europe and to Canada talking about the book. But it's important always to say that I am not an American exceptionalist. I'm not, because I'm going to criticize Turkey a lot. But being a civil rights lawyer in the United States and in Texas, I'm fully aware of the deficiencies of our own system and the civil rights challenges that we face all the time. So my criticism is based upon more of a human rights perspective generally than it is anything else that comes up. So why prosecute Fethullah Gülen and the movement, Hizmet? Fethullah Gülen, of course, if you've done any reading about him or been on the trips or anything, you know that he comes out of the Sufi movement in Islam, the Turkish version or branch of Sufism, if you will, which is a very moderate kind of almost mystical, well, not almost, it's sort of a mystical practice of Islam. It's very tolerant, very non-judgmental, very ecumenical, for which science is very important. And it comes out of the Rumi tradition. Rumi, of course, Sufi poet, mystic, who's one of the best-selling authors ever in the United States. So you have that particular ecumenical approach, and Gulen represents that movement. He's the teacher of that movement at this particular time. And there's a saying that Sufis have, what they are about, and that is good people doing good things. So out of this Sufism, this Islamic movement, if you want to call it that, branch, there is a very strong emphasis on building civil society. And so Hizmet, as is practiced by people who are followers of Fethullah Gülen, really concentrate on civil society, building civil society. And that's making, of course, our lives, the lives of the community better. But it is not, it's not a kind of a practice of religion where you try to convert people, right? It's good people doing good things, tolerant, ecumenical, respectful of what people's traditions are, but trying to unite in a common effort to build civil society. And part of that civil society, or Hizmet, that, a lot of you may be familiar with this, but about some of the movement, but this really comes into play as to why Fethullah Gülen is prosecuted and persecuted. And it's also, if you're following Turkish events, now he and the movement are again at odds with the government, and a lot of it's over the same issues about what's coming out of Hizmet, what comes out of the movement. And one of the very important aspects of Hizmet, of the movement, is to promote education. And it's to promote a sort of a rigorous scientific education. It's not I went to a Catholic school when I was a kid, and so we always had classes presented with a certain vantage point, if you want to put it that way, right? But that's not what these schools are and we have actually 42 of these in Texas now, that schools all around the world, in 140 countries. And we have 42 in Texas. And the waiting list, for example, in Texas is 28,000 kids right now to get into these schools. So they have a very good reputation. They are around the world, but they started principally in Turkey, obviously. And what they did is, Gulen is famous for saying what we need in our community is not more mosques, but more schools. So the emphasis in the beginning of the movement was to build schools. And the schools were built in the Anatolia area, the Asian side of Turkey. And also, a lot of the schools went into poor communities and into the Kurdish area. Why that's important is because there were no schools before for kids. There weren't enough schools, I should say. And why it's important in the Kurdish area is that, and as Gulen himself would say, it's better to give the kids something to do than to have them go to the mountains and train as guerrillas. It was also very important for girls, because the Kurdish area is very conservative religiously, and a lot of parents did not want their girls to go to school with boys. So these schools are an alternative in a sense, and to help girls go to school, get educated, instead of having kids starting at 14, and that's the rest of their life, is just raising the kids. So it offered a lot of alternatives. I remember when after I wrote the book, I went over to Turkey to talk. It was in Antalya, and after I talked, somebody, whoever was with me, said, "You want to go see one of the schools?" Well, I had seen them before, of course, but I said, "Yeah." So we went to a school, and it was in a very poor area of the city. And so I go in. I have two kids that are teachers, so I'm always interested in seeing what's going on so I can talk to them about it. So I go in, and they're fourth grade, and it's great. I don't have the picture up, but it's a great picture of them. And there were these desks where two kids sit to the desk. There's two kids to a desk. So I said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Typical adult question, right? And then you get the typical answer. "I want to be a teacher. I want to be a fireman. I want to police officer. I want to be a lawyer," all that kind of stuff. And it was a lot of fun. But the thing is, I realized when I was there that these kids would never have these dreams but for that school. They wouldn't be in school. So this school had a way of giving them their dreams. This is the problem for the establishment: educating people, giving them dreams. Because what happened up until the time of the movement is that the wealth and the power was concentrated in Istanbul. And the Anatolia area was treated sort of like the hinterlands, not with much respect, not with much resources. And what happened then is, as the movement emphasized education and people got educated, then they wanted their own part of the pie. Why should all the pie be in Istanbul? Well, nobody who has money or power, as we know, gives it up willingly. So that's part of the problem. What fits into that also is the activism of the movement. And the movement's very active. It maintains and supports, we talked about the schools, but also foundations around the world, particularly in Turkey, to deal with calamities that occur. It's dealing with the mining collapse now, but a year before last, when the earthquake in Western Turkey raised $70 million overnight, for that. medical care and stuff, but also build schools and clinics in Africa, for example, and around the world. But Africa is really a target right now in Turkey. So the idea of the movement being active in building a civil society is supported by folks who believe in the movement. This is tithing. This is a concept, of course, we have in the Bible, right? 10% of your time, 10% of your money. And so that's in Islam, you give it to a worthy cause, and so folks give it to the movement and sustain the movement. That's how you have the Hizmet office here and all around the world. It is how it funds the schools and the clinics and the hospitals and the interfaith trips that go on. So there's nothing proselytizing about the movement. But it's interesting that it reaches outside of Turkey to us, right? And tries to engage us in civil society. We sort of have the mindset that we United States, right? We're the ones who reach out, engage people. So it's kind of an interesting phenomena for us that we see this happening the other way. It's good, obviously, to have ecumenical movement like this. But anyway, back to Turkey, back to Gulen in the movement. There was another part of the activism that was growing, and that was getting involved in media and getting involved in, newspapers, same thing, in TV stations. Get up a newspaper, Saman, which is in opposition at this point to the current government quite often. And in the movement, it's interesting, as this is difficult for me as a lawyer to understand in the beginning, is that there's no kind of structure in the way Americans believe in structure. And this is a problem, too, for the movement in the trial. You know, we think, at least I do, Americans tend to think, who's the board of directors, who's the CEO, who's the CFO, you know, where are the all of the rules and policies and that we have and all this kind of stuff. Well, the movement, it doesn't function like that. There is no central structure that you can go to and say, who's the CEO and how do I talk to the board of directors about changing that and all that kind of stuff. It's a very informal structure. There's a reason, there are two reasons for it, I think. One is, and I'll get to this in the trial part, is that if there is a structure in Turkey, then the government has had the history of seizing its assets. So it's better not to have close corporate affiliation with one school with another, for example. And in Turkey, and this happens with Gulen, when Gulen is indicted, and he's indicted as a terrorist, even though there's never been any claim of violence. In Turkey, you can indict your organization along with you. So if you have, so that means, and this is what happened. So they would indict Hizmet institutions, and they would try to tie him to the institutions and say, we want all the assets. And the thing is, even if you're found innocent, the government can still keep your assets. Now, we do that in the United States, too. So just to keep this in perspective, right? If your son or daughter has a joint in the trunk of the car, the officer is entitled to seize the car, civil forfeiture. So this is a similar procedure that goes on, even though if the kid isn't convicted, even though if your son or daughter is not convicted, civil forfeiture means you can still take the car. This is what was going on in Turkey. So this is one reason. The other reason is just the way Sufis are. I mean, it is a religious tradition that is unorganized. I mean, it doesn't have hierarchy and clergy and like that. So anyway, it took me a long time as a lawyer to understand that. So, and the way it happened, when I was we had supper in somebody's house in Izmir, and so I'm talking to this guy. He's a businessman. He's got a lot of money. And he said he was sponsoring a clinic somewhere in Africa. I don't remember the country. And he said, and people on the other side of town are sponsoring a clinic also in Africa, but it's in a different country. I said, well, how do you figure this out? How do you figure it out? So you don't build the same clinic in the same place, or you spread out resources, so you don't concentrate everything in one country. And he said, well, we just get together once a month and talk, contribute, and that's how we do it. And so Helen Ebal has a book. She's a Houston sociologist that went around and gathered information, and that's she has the same experience of trying to explain how the movement funds itself. Now, why this is politically dangerous to a government is because there is no structure. They know there's something going on out there, but they can't see it with any sort of tangibility. So this is alarming for the government. And this is one of the reasons that he ends up, as I just said a few minutes ago, charged as a terrorist. Now, terrorism, well, obviously it sounds horrible as a word. In Turkey, at this time, it does not mean the kind of terrorism we talk about associated with violence. It means changing the essential nature of the government. Changing the essential nature of the government. So if you said, for example, and Turkey has a parliamentary system. If you said what we ought to do is change the parliamentary system to a presidential system, then you could be charged with terrorism under this law. This is a pure political statute that was organized to keep the status quo. And Gulen is not the only person prosecuted under this statute, but it was used actually quite frequently. So, the reason and how they said he was changing the essential nature of government is that the government said he was making himself the main religious leader in the country. And in Turkey, even though Turkey is a secular state, it governs religion. There's a ministry of religion. So they said what Gulen was trying to do was supplant himself as the minister of religion, right? Taking that power away from the government. All of that but there's other stuff going on, too, in reality, with respect to this charge. So I think it's important to keep in mind, that when we talk about Turkey being secular, when we use the word secular in the United States, we mean something completely, quite different than the way it's used in Turkey and in Europe in many places. When we talk about it here in the United States, there are two parts of it. One is freedom of religion, freedom to do what you want, right? And the other part of that is non-institutionalization of religion. The church cannot become part of government. Government cannot promote the church. In Turkey, it only means one thing. Turkey does not protect freedom of expression. In other words, let me give you an example. When I left Houston to go to Turkey the last time, I went with some judges. One of the women at the checkpoint, or the security point, right, was wearing a headscarf. And when I get to the airport in Istanbul, you won't see that, because the government does not permit religious expression in the public sphere. In the United States, our philosophy is so long as it does not interfere with your work, then you're entitled to practice your religion. But it was different at it's Turkey, and that comes out of the French anti-clerical idea of secular, laïcité, that went on. And a lot of the founders of Turkey had studied in France and picked up that particular brand of secular thought and is imposed in the Constitution. So part of this then that comes into the prosecution of Gulen is the feeling that he's disturbing that balance as well, that he's undermining that balance has been enshrined in the Constitution. Okay, so the getting ready, the people are moving to prosecute Fethullah Gülen, but the way it happens is that it begins with a media campaign against him. And ironically, that's going on again in Turkey at this point, but we can talk about that later. Turkey, unfortunately, has gone through a series of coups. It seems to be like a 10-year event. One of the worst was in 1960, when they actually the military intervened and actually hanged the prime minister and two of the ministers. And so we have successive coups, and then there's about every 10 years, I say, but there's a soft coup, what's called a soft coup, on February 28th in 97. So we had a hard coup, which is a direct military intervention in 60, 71, 80, and then you have the soft coup in 97. And the reason it's soft is the government. This is beginning to use. This is a use of the internet for email for coups. The military basically posted a notice that if the government didn't resign, that the military would help the government resign. So that's what happened. But what happens with this soft coup, if you want to call it, I mean, it's just as pervasive in the change of government as a hard coup. So what happens then is that you see the beginning of prosecution or attacks on the media throughout the political spectrum. So the military, whatever it has decided is the middle ground, people on both sides of that are being prosecuted. So you have the communists and everybody else. Communists being a legitimate party at that time. And then you have also the religious leaders, and one of whom is Fethullah Gülen, that the government goes after, or tries to prosecute. So what's going on here in at this era, as I'm talking about, was part of there's this move to economically redistribute the pie, and to move some of economic and political power over to Anatolia. And you know this plays out in Turkish culture. You have the Black Turks and the White Turks, and you have the military as a player. You also have the media as an important player here. And all of this that I'm going to talk about is called the deep state. This is sort of this government that operates, the informal government that operates under the auspices of the formal government. So you have the military powers, the economic powers, which are basically the banks and the media. And the part of the military economic powers that it has its own businesses and its own claim on the budget. The military at this time would get 40% of the national budget from the government without even having to say what the money was for. It didn't have to present a budget. It just said, we want 40%, and the government writes the check. So you had that sort of interplay. And then you have the generals, when they retired, would go over and sit on the bank boards and sit on the media boards. So you had that going on. It was called the deep state because of the manipulative nature of it. And I can come back. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I can come back and talk about that. So all this is going on, deep state, and this came out formally in the legal trials that went on with the Gulen and the sledgehammer. Okay, So the media campaign begins against Gulen after the soft coup, right? And this goes on for a while. Starts in the summer of '98, and there's builds and builds and builds in the media campaign. So all sorts of allegations come up, right? I always enjoy this part of the book because he's accused of being a secret agent of Iran, a secret agent of China, a secret agent of the CIA, secret agent of Mooney, you know, Reverend Mooney, right? My favorite is that he's a secret cardinal of the Pope. Now, you know, the chances of that happening are, well, maybe with this current Pope, who knows, but back under the old popes, it wouldn't have happened. But you can see what they're doing in the campaign. They're playing to different audiences, right? CIA is always a bugaboo in Turkey, right? And well-deserved reputation, probably. And then, you know, when you talk about the secret cardinal, then you're playing off of the hardcore religionists, Islamic religionists, you know, and all that. So it doesn't matter. Truth doesn't matter, right? It's just the smear campaign that went on. So what's significant is in '98, when this is going on, Yüksel, who was a state prosecutor, he comes back in 2000 when the trial happens, and he calls Gulen in and says, I need to talk to you because I'm hearing all these charges in the press, and I need to check and see if they're true. And Yüksel interviews, Gulen goes in, Yüksel interviews him and lets him go. Says there's nothing here. This is important because they'll come back in a minute. And then, of course, the last part of this thing, and then I'm just going to start talking, the trial part of this is actually very short, so I'm much closer to being done than you think. And also the other bad part was of the society at this time is the structure of the courts. The courts are not independent. And what happened in the beginning of the Republic is there was set up to be the Supreme Council of Judges and Prosecutors, and then they would just reappoint themselves, right? They would select the new judges, the new prosecutors, so it was a self-perpetuating mechanism. There was no democratic input. In the United States, of course, the president is elected, president then appoints federal judges, Senate might or might not allow that. Some states like mine, we directly elect judges. Turkey, there was none of that. So this whole judicial system is perpetuating that ideology from the beginning, what's called Kemalism, the idea that what the republic should be. What was the wild card? The wild card in all of this, you know, typically at this point you would predict that Gulen would go into a trial, lose, and end up in jail. He doesn't. What's the wild card? The wild card is the European Union. Turkey has decided that it's going to move toward the European Union. European Union, of course, goes, we don't know about this, but if you want to come, you have to change a lot of things. One of them you have to change is your judicial structure. It has to become more democratic, and you've got to adopt civil liberties. So Turkey actually begins to do that, begins to change. And you will see it happen in two important ways during the 8-year trial that ultimately changes the outcome. Trial, 2000, Fethullah Gülen. 1999, he leaves and comes to the United States. They didn't actually find him after the soft coup. They had found him before. So he avoids the soft coup. He ends up, and he comes to the United States for medical treatments at Mayo, and then moves over to Pennsylvania. And after I wrote the book, I didn't want to go see him before I wrote the book, but after I wrote the book, I went and saw him. And I remember it's like one of those Boy Scout camps we used to have in Michigan, you know, out in the woods, nice little stream going through and cabins, that kind of thing. So he goes into basically retirement there. But he's still indicted, and you can still be tried in Turkey without being present. And so that trial happens. And then the indictment's filed, and as I said earlier, so is Hizmet indicted. So if you look at the indictment, it says, you know, Fethullah Gülen for terrorism and Hizmet for terrorism. And it's an 80-page indictment. It's filled with all the same stuff that's been in the media, just all replay. In fact, Yüksel has been leaking it to the media. So there's been a coordinated effort between the media and Yüksel, the prosecutor. And they asked for 10 years of heavy punishment, which means solitary confinement and seizure of all the assets. So the indictment, and I have all of this stuff up on the web. If you ever want to look at any of these legal documents in English or in Turkish, there's a website associated with the book that you can look at all this stuff if you want. But anyway, the indictment has all the charges I was talking about. And then there's some fabricated tapes where people splice some of his speeches together, make him sound really bad. And I mean, it's just, the splicing is terrible. I mean, just look at it. It's like, what they're doing. But truth wasn't really the objective here, and never was the objective at that time of the legal system. So it starts. He's indicted, and when he's indicted, actually, you still have state security courts. They used to have military courts where you went on trial for this terrorism thing. Well, they have adopted state security courts. So instead of having 3 military officers, you have 1 military officer and 2 non-military. But the military still drive you home at the end of the day, and they pick you up for work, right? They're driving the other 2 judges home, and then they pick them up for work. So you might not be in the military, but you know how you're supposed to vote. So those judges, so you have that court, and Gulen is indicted in state security court. And they tried to extradite him, revoke the bond, and stuff. That doesn't happen. So nothing happens for a very long time, for a couple years. This is not unusual in Turkish courts. People are just, these are civil law society. So in the United States, we have jury trials, and we try to do the trial right away, as close as possible to the evidence. Well, in the civil code states, like which most of Europe is, and Turkey, you have 3 judges who gather evidence, and then when they feel like they're done, then they issue their opinion. So that's what's going on here. So there are deposition and things going on in this. But in 2 years, in 2002, Turkey has to abolish the state security courts because of the European Union. European Union says you can't have these parallel courts for terrorism. So they abolish it, and then Gulen moves over to the civil system. That's good, because it got rid of the 3 judges that were there, 1 military and 2 non-military, but they were very hostile, and ends up in another, over in the regular civil system. So the case keeps on moving, slowly, and witnesses and depositions and evidence, all that kinds of stuff, and then change 2 from the European Union. This is the wild card. European Union has said, you've got to change the definition of terrorism. You cannot punish terrorism for political speech. There has to be an act of violence. It has to be politics plus violence. So this is now, we're 2006. So the trial's gone on for 6 years. And under Turkish law, if the law changes under which you were indicted, you're entitled to take advantage of the new law. So Gulen was indicted under the old Turkish terrorism law. It changed. It was to his advantage, and so he elected to continue the trial under the new charge. That's the game changer, because nobody has ever said, Gulen or anybody in the movement has ever done anything violent. That is just not on the table. So Gulen's lawyers then file a motion for judgment, basically. Settle the case, judges, and based upon this change. And so the lawyers take it under, the judges accept the case, and they render a verdict of innocence, not guilty. And what's really interesting about this is when you read the judgment that the judges issue, they go through every one of the charges that had been in the press, in the media, and debunk them. So even the stuff you hear these days that has come back has already been adjudicated. Nobody could prove it, you know, and then based upon the evidence, the judge debunked all of that. Okay, we're getting close to the end, but there's an American story at the very end that you'll love. So anyway, acquittal by the trial judges, 2006. It goes up to appellate. First round of appellate, 5 judges. 2 years later, acquittal. And then it goes up to all of the full plenary appellate court, which actually decides the case in 2 months. And that was 17-6 in his favor. So he wins. It's a great victory for Turkey, great victory for him, great victory for law, process of law, civil liberties, practice of religion. Ironically, at the same time he wins that case in Turkey, he's winning a case in the United States. When he came to the United States, he got a religious visa, religious scholar visa. And when the trial heated up in Turkey, the United States tried to revoke Gülen's visa. And so, if you know anything about immigration law in the United States, it's extraordinarily hard to get into court. Congress has tried to take courts out of this. But Gülen's lawyers got into court, and they drew a very conservative Republican judge, but he was a straight shooter, totally a straight shooter, no matter what the politics were. And he just said, what? He has been in this country for more than 5 years. You already granted him religious scholar status. Are you telling me he's not a scholar? How many books has he written? Well, you know, more than 70. You know, and all these preached these sermons and tapes and all this. And then the judge says, look, isn't this a type of Islamic religious leader we want in the United States, who talks about tolerance and a different view of Islam that we generally see in the media? And then she said, there's more discussion about the evidence, and the judge said, well, you know, there's a picture of him with the Pope. He's over in Rome visiting the Pope. Now, if you've seen this, I don't know if you've seen the pictures of Glen and the Pope, but there are a number of them, and they're videos. The attorney says to the judge, Your Honor, we think those are photoshopped. You know, that's just nonsense. I mean, it's nonsense. This is as bad as what's going on in the Turkish courts. The judge then blows a gasket and says, if you're a lawyer, you know what this means. Counsel, whoever's making this decision, I want that person in front of me tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. That is not a good sign if you're a lawyer. It's a very bad sign. She says, and actually she has come from Washington. This case is going on in Philadelphia. She has been sent by Homeland Security to try the case. It's not the regular U.S. attorney doing this, or immigration attorney. She says, Your Honor, the person making this decision is so high up in the administration, I cannot bring him here. So you can figure out how high that goes. Anyway, the judge just says, well, that's it, and grants the status. So within a month, he's won 2 major victories.
What year?
This is 2008. It's either Rumsfeld or Cheney, if that's what you're trying to figure out. That's what that's what people think. That's when it went that high. It makes a lot of sense in terms of money, because of the fact that the Turkish military train here in the United States. And I think we give them almost $1 billion a year toward armaments. They're a NATO partner. And we have the base there that we've used for Afghanistan and Iraq. Then the cream on the pudding or whatever here is that he was also selected this year. There was as one of the most intelligent or greatest intellectual leaders of the world. There was this contest put on by U.S. Foreign Policy, and the British counterpart, I don't remember what it was, but which is okay, Prospect, and then it has which is liberal, and then of course U.S. Foreign Policy is more conservative, and end up top 100 intellectuals. Actually, I think it was one of the top 10. So it was really good outcome, but it was really good in terms of Turkey, in terms of helping to become more democratic and process the institutions. Of course, a lot of that's been unfortunately reversed or undermined in the last couple of years by the current prime minister. But I think once people feel that and have lived that no matter what the current government's doing, that it's there for people to use and to build upon in the future. In saying that, I'd actually like to read, if I can quickly get it, this final quote from Noam Chomsky, actually. When I was writing the book, I was over in Turkey. I went over a couple times. I interviewed a lot of people. And I interviewed a lot of people who themselves and their families had gone through the coups, the military coups. And, had had relatives killed or had been in prison a long time. And some people themselves who had to go into self-exile, had to leave the country because it was just too hot for them, particularly journalists. So when I was writing the book, I came across this quote from Chomsky that I thought really fit well into the interviews that I had done while I was reading the book. So I'll read this to you, and that'll be the end. I know of no other country where leading writers, artists, journalists, academics, and other intellectuals have compiled such an impressive record of bravery and integrity in condemning crimes of state and going beyond to engage in civil disobedience to try to bring oppression and violence to an end, facing and sometimes enduring severe repression, and then returning to the task. It is an honorable record, unique in my knowledge, a record of which the country should be proud, and one that should be a model for others. So, thank you for your patience.
So, let me open the floor for the questions. If you could just briefly introduce yourself for asking the question, name and affiliation. Then you may answer a question. Any questions? So let me ask the first question now. How do you see the main problems of legal system in Turkey at the time and maybe now too? I think there's been some backtracking, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way the legal system was, as I had described it, where it was controlled, it was brilliant. Whoever wrote the Constitution did a brilliant job in, perpetuating a particular sorts of power or the division of the state in each one of the branches of government, and it was perpetuated very well in the judicial, so that it was self-selecting, self-perpetuating, which meant that it protected its ideology. Now, as a result of, again, as a part of the European Union aspect of this, in improving the judicial system, there were a series of constitutional amendments that happened in, I believe it's 2010. It's the 30th anniversary of the 1980 coup. And the Constitution comes out of the 1980 coup. So on exactly on the 30th anniversary, Turkey holds a constitutional referendum, most of which is dedicated to civil liberties, and basically adopting a Bill of Rights like we have in the United States, though more expansive than ours. But an important part of that was it changed the selection of judges. So now there would be, into that commission that selects judges and prosecutors, there would be input from Parliament and input from the President and input from other judges and lawyers from the outside, not the people who had been selected on the commission, but people from the outside. And I had noticed when I was interviewing people that the judges the younger judges, had a very different sense of responsibility toward the law, and were more respectful of the law as an institution. And part of this was because the European Union had put a lot of money into training judges. In fact, one of the judges I interviewed had gone on a scholarship to Oxford to study law there. And it had a big change in his thinking, which was the idea. So those changes were very good, and because they helped bring different beliefs into the legal system, helped have democratic input, and helped make it a little bit more independent. What's happened under the present Prime Minister, Erdogan, is that he is trying to retract some of that change that has gone on in the Turkish constitution. Even where it ended up in 2010, it still wasn't, it still needed to be much better, but that was progress. But even with that progress, he's retrenching, and you'll see him now talking about the input that he wants to have on nominating, selecting judges. So, and then he doesn't, there's a whole issue about whether he respects civil liberties in terms of the press and the demonstrations that have gone on in the environmental cause, Gezi Park, and then the effort to suppress internet and YouTube and Twitter. And even when the Constitutional Court said, you got to let people watch YouTube, you can't suppress it, he still waited 2 weeks before he did anything. So you have that question about whether he really has a sort of respect for the constitutional process or changes that you need to have in order to make them strong and vibrant. So we'll see how it turns out, but it's not.
Yeah, John.
Yes.
What year again is the original indictment, and what year does the ACT Party come into power?
The original indictment is 2000, and I'm not exactly sure when ACT Party comes into power. About the same time.
2002 elections.
2002, about the same time.
Doesn't that change the climate in terms of secularization and religious liberty? They certainly are more friendly than the Kemalists about religious liberty and religious expression.
But yes, that's true. That is definitely true. But that's at the very beginning, right? I mean, the change is just beginning when they're coming in, because you remember the prior government had been Islamist too, and that's where they did the coup, the soft coup. So they're coming in, and there is some change going. There's no doubt that there's changes going on, but this is left over going on, and then also the way the judiciary is structured. And the main character here is pushing this is a prosecutor named Yüksel. He's a state prosecutor. And the way the judiciary is structured, AK wouldn't be able to penetrate it anyway at that point.
I find it interesting the way you describe the EU as being a game changer. And I wonder if there's any lessons for the United States, either in terms of its policy towards Turkey or in general of foreign policy, of what you saw as a game changer, where the United States has an interest in developing broader civil rights and human rights across the globe.
Yes, I mean that's always a good question. Right, and we don't do it well enough. I mean, the reason I think EU was successful is it was tied, the economics are tied to human rights, right? At that time, Turkey wanted to come into the EU for economic reasons. Since then, of course, the economy's equation has changed a bit. But it was that motivation. And then also what was going on in the country is that you did have what you want to call the intellectual folks, the journalists and everything that Chomsky calls, beginning to push. The good thing about Turkey, in a sense, and this is why it's not a model, I think, for Arab Spring, well, not that anything is anymore. Turkey actually had, on paper, a tradition of democracy, right? And so it wasn't like you're starting a whole new system, you're moving as you would with a monarchy or a dictatorship, that sort of thing. And I think it got to the point that there was enough intellectual and social fermentation in the country that it could seize upon this European Union economic thing and help blend them together and convince AK at that time, too, look, you know, if you want to be in on the economy of this, then the human rights is part of that. And so everybody's bought into that. And, you know, we've tried to do that from time to time in our foreign policy, right, to tie it to human rights. And, of course, depending on the vicissitudes or the needs of our foreign policy. But I think the economic component was key. You just don't get people to do good things out of the goodness of their heart, always, or often. It's I don't claim to be an observer, you know, have any knowledge other than that.
Gulen hasn't had much influence on you.
Yeah.
Yes, please. You can also introduce yourself in a minute, please.
Yes, my name is Gloria Moran. I'm professor of Spanish law. I teach law, religion, and public policy. My question is regarding to not only the European Union, who plays the economical part, but the Council of Europe, which it
Oh, yes. Yes.
I think that is the main thing regarding to human rights and the
Yes.
Court of Human Rights.
Yes. That's a very good point, and I talk about that in the book, too. Is that is a good point, is that Turkey actually signed on to that earlier.
That's right.
Before,
That's
yeah.
the waiting room for the European Union.
Yeah.
In fact.
Yeah, I think they signed on in 48. I think they're the first non-organizing country that signed on to it. And I think all that stuff is good because it puts it there, even if it's not used, right? I mean, our Bill of Rights, we couldn't bring a lawsuit under our Bill of Rights until early 20th century. Even though the Bill of Rights was there, our thinking about it had not evolved enough that we could use the courts to vindicate it. But so you're entirely right. And to Turkey's credit, it has always accepted the jurisdiction. And if the court says, you screwed up, pay them off, Turkey doesn't. It's amazing. Now, the U.S. doesn't do that.
Yes.
We belong to the Inter-American Court, and we don't, you know, we'll accept jurisdiction when we feel like it. So that's a very good point. And that was actually lurking there before, or not lurking, but it was really there behind the scenes prior to the European Union. Yeah.
And the Treaty of Rome.
Yes, the Treaty of Rome, right. Yeah, I found that to be, you know, when I was writing the book, I found that to be actually very impressive. I'm glad you brought it up. I found it to be really, really impressive, you know, that was going on to Turkey's credit.
Yes, Sinan Bey.
You mentioned that during the trial process, the Turkish government asked for an extradition from the U.S. government, and somehow that did not take place. As we know, the current government is also seeking some sort of an extradition or deportation of him from the country. What's your take on that? What do you think the United States is going to do?
The United States wouldn't honor it. You know, this is a problem with Erdogan. He's very impulsive and has a big mouth at many times. He says the wrong stuff quite vehemently. And my take on it is he doesn't really mean it. He was there throwing it out as a threat. But even if he tried to do it, I mean, there's no crime. You can't extradite somebody for no crime. And Gulen has status in the United States. He has a legitimate visa. So, I mean, to me, it was just, when I heard that, I just I mean, the other thing, I mean, the other thing, what he's doing is he's trying to scare, he's at war with Hizmet right now. And this is a way of scaring Hizmet, right? Say, you know, we're going to get you, I'm going to get your leader over here. You know, and so I think a lot of it's just huffing and puffing and intimidation, but we'll see. But there's no chance he could ever have that ability. I mean, it'd be like him trying to pull you back to Turkey. There's no crime on the table. But that you know.
My name is Lindsay. I'm a student at Wofford College in South Carolina. My question is, you said Turkey has been traditionally a democracy on paper. What is your personal definition of democracy, and how far do you think Turkey is from that? So there are many different definitions
Yeah.
of democracy, so I'd like to hear what you think.
Man, I don't know if I have a personal definition of democracy. I think, you know, I think that it's a very hard question about what democracy is, because I think it has to be tailored to your country and your culture. And I mean, there's a lot of, I look at probably, if I had to speak off the cuff about democracy, it would be how do you aggrandize the level of participation by the general population? What kind of rule of law and order do you have? How do you protect individual liberties and dissent? And where is Turkey on that? It's a good question. I think you have to, depends on what you're talking about. In terms of speech right now and surveillance, very low. I mean, it's wholesale attack on speech going on. I'd say in the practice of religion is becoming much better. It's much more tolerant, even though it's a secular state. But religious minorities were not protected, and that's better. That's definitely better. People vote, but the problem is that you don't have a two-party or multi-party. I mean, basically, you have a one-party state right now. And that's not good. That's never good. You have a one-party state. So it's like our country, right? I mean, it's up and down, but you hope that you're moving up slowly, but surely in some way or another. And I think that's the way Turkey is.
Any more questions? So the time is up. Thank you for attending. Let's thank you again.
Thank you all for coming.